Now, Israel's military aid agency, Cogat, has confirmed that the Rafah crossing will not be used for humanitarian aid. That's despite the number of trucks queuing on the Egypt side of the crossing. Aid is being driven to other crossing points, such as Kerem Shalom. Rafah is the only crossing that does not, border Israel. Cogat said a date for the reopening of Rafah for people to cross through will be made at a later stage. Meanwhile, 2 bodies handed over to Israel on Wednesday have now been identified. They are Imba Heyman, who was 27 and from Haifa, and Mohammed Al-Tarash, who served as a trucker in the Gaza Division's Northern Brigade. 19 other hostages remain unaccounted for. US officials have downplayed claims that Hamas is violating the ceasefire deal with Israel by not yet returning all the bodies of the dead hostages. Well, let's get the very latest from our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Nell, who's in Jerusalem for us. So, Yolande, it's a confusing picture in terms of what's happening at the Rafah crossing. Just explain to us what we know so far.
So the Israeli defense body Cogat, which controls the crossings, has now put out a statement, and it said that preparations are ongoing with Egypt to open the Rafah crossing for the movement of people, with the date to be announced at a future stage. Now, there are patients waiting to exit from Gaza, the sick and the wounded. They're on a list that's already been approved by Egypt and Israel, and it's thought they will be the first to be able to go out from Gaza into Egypt when the crossing does open. Now, what we're seeing on the Egyptian side is hundreds of lorry loads of aid. It's a main supply route for aid to go into Gaza. But what's happening to that aid? It gets up towards the border and then carries on to cross into Israel, then makes its way to the Kerem Shalom, the main Israeli crossing point with Gaza in the very south of the Gaza Strip. And that is where most of the aid is going in after undergoing Israeli security checks. Now, of course, Israel had warned it would keep Rafah closed, which does seem to be what is happening at the moment, and it would stop aid from going in the quantities that had been previously agreed because of this issue around the return of the hostages' bodies. We have now had 9 of these bodies given back by Hamas and positively identified by the Israeli authorities. That leaves 19 still outstanding. And, basically, Israel is not buying the line from Hamas's armed wing that it can't access all of the remaining bodies.
And so does this delay in terms of the release of the bodies of the dead hostages and in terms of the reopening of the Rafah crossing point to a weak moment for the ceasefire?
I mean, there have been concerns this week that this could be one of the issues that could potentially derail the ceasefire agreement. But then we've had the US coming out really seeking to shore it up. We had President Trump, when he was talking to journalists, really saying how difficult it was for some of these bodies to be accessed, that they were under rubble, that they were in underground tunnels, he said. And then there was a briefing given by 2 senior advisors from the Trump administration, where they said that they were looking with other mediators at different ways to locate the remaining bodies, that they were acting in good faith. And they said that it was possible now a Turkish team of sort of 80 strong experts who have recovered bodies previously after earthquakes, that they could go into Gaza to assist with this effort, that they were also talking about possible cash payments to Gazan civilians as an incentive for them to give information about locations of the bodies of hostages.
And Yolande, we currently have images coming into us from a commemoration service in Israel for soldiers killed on October the 7th and during the war in Gaza. Just talk us through what's happening today in Israel in terms of these official ceremonies.
Well, there are 2 official ceremonies taking place in Jerusalem at Mount Herzl. They'll be overseen by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. These are the commemorations for the 2nd anniversary of the 7th of October attacks. Basically, according to the Hebrew calendar, there's going to be one, first of all, the one that's taking place at the moment is for soldiers who were killed on the 7th of October and in the war that's followed over the past 2 years. And then later in the day, there'll be a ceremony ceremony for the civilians killed. On the 7th of October, about 1,200 people were killed in those deadly Hamas attacks in southern Israel. What many Israelis will be looking for is any sort of suggestion that now there is this ceasefire in place, that the government might go ahead with a big public demand for an official state commission of inquiry into the events that led up to the 7th of October attacks.
Yolande, thank you. That's our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Neal in Jerusalem there. Well, Sarah Yerkes is Senior Fellow in the Middle East Programme at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She gave us her perspective on the situation in Gaza.
The ceasefire is incredibly fragile, which is to be expected. But I think what we've seen just in these past couple of days since the ceasefire began is that both sides are already accusing each other of violations. And the repercussions of that, on the one hand, Israel is not getting the bodies that it thought it was going to be getting. And for Hamas and for the Gazans, they're not getting the aid that they expected to be getting. So there's a lot of really dangerous things happening where this could really just dissolve back into conflict very quickly if the parties continue to accuse each other of not holding up their end of the bargain. I do think that both Hamas and Israel want the ceasefire to hold. And importantly, the international community wants the ceasefire to hold. And so you do need that pressure, whether it's from the United States, whether it's from the Arab leaders, on the various parties to remind them that it's so much more in their interest to keep the ceasefire going than it is for the ceasefire to end. So I do think we are in a different situation than we were during previous ceasefires. And I do think the parties, even though this is difficult, are much more committed to holding this ceasefire than we've seen in the past. Hamas has been pretty honest about the fact that it can't return any more of the bodies. It needs help to do that. And so the question is, are we going to see that assistance come in quickly? And has Israel been convinced, as we expect them to be today, to allow the aid to start to flow through Rafah? I mean, this is what we really need to see, is that aid coming in, starting to see some real tangible change for the lives of the Palestinians. But on the other hand, I think what we've seen is the behavior of Hamas, who clearly is not interested in disarming at this point, clearly is not interested in giving up its role as the leader of Gaza at this point. And so we need to see some good faith efforts from Hamas there. But we have to remember, they have not yet promised that they would disarm. They have not yet promised that they would give up their political role either. And so those sorts of expectations are quite high, yet I don't think we're going to see that happen anytime soon.